I want to begin by just thanking lots of people for starting with the political concepts group community for even inviting me to join Ariella and Aliyyah and Leela to put this thing together. It was it has been a real privilege and an honor, and just listening to everyone today, extraordinary pleasure. The power of everyone's presentations and for it to see it happen, and the extraordinary amount of hard work that I've seen my colleagues, Ariella in particular, put behind bringing this together, and of course also the staff, Kate and Trod, who make all things possible at the ground level. It's been an accumulation of responsibilities in the last weeks, leading me various moments to want to pull out of this, but I have waited, and here with having done my share of waiting, thinking with waiting, what I will present is going to be a set of thoughts that might begin somewhat more articulately and then meander into terrain less so, at which point I will end with two videos, one of an artist that I'll be speaking about, and another shared by a graduate student of mine as I was thinking with and in line with waiting. Okay, it would seem that we can no longer wait. It is imperative that we wait no longer. The time for waiting is past. And if that is so, then we should understand, how should we understand this waiting? And if that is so, then how should we understand this waiting, such that we must now refuse it, now refuse it? So I came to thinking about waiting through the work of a contemporary artist called Bani Abadi, someone who attempted to live between India and Pakistan, and then had to retreat to the city of Berlin. And in her work that came to be shown in Berlin this past summer, I re-encountered what were the ordinary scenes of waiting that she constructed that were doggedly familiar to me. To many of us who have grown up in the post-colony under some form of authoritarian rule, waiting for hours for the presidential address on state-controlled television, or routine and seemingly endless stoppages of traffic, waiting for officials to pass through, or waiting in lines in government offices for visa applications at checkposts, or simply waiting by the side of the road, looking out to sea, or as a feat accomplished in waiting, as in the man who waited for 45 years. Can we think of this waiting as a duration of time that is quite distinct from hiatus, interval, or intermission, where a movement, a flow has been paused? A hiatus or interval carries with it the expectation of resumption, a certainty of resumption, the rhythm of eventual progress. Its finitude is secure. Such is our confidence in the resumption that we can rest or even walk around during an interval. Film screenings in India, in Indian cinemas, have always had a welcome intermission. Waiting, on the other hand, is an in-between concept of time that has no necessary beginning or end. It is instead tied to expectation and anticipation of something that is both concrete and spectral at the same time, but that it is not yet realized. The not yet of waiting can feel like forever. Or as Martin Luther King put it in that famous line, this wait has almost always meant forever, or has always meant never. Waiting, thus, is a condition of coercion. It is conditioned by coercion. And although sometimes its coercive apparatus is visible, and at other times it is harder to perceive, it needs to be taken apart as a technique of containment, of control. It is as such an incarceral and a pedagogic concept of time. In James Coetzee's novel, Waiting for the Barbarians, General Joel points out that empire has created the time of history. Empire has created the time of history. This time of history, what Johann Fabian once called the denial of coevalness to some in the formation of the modern world, the first in Europe and then elsewhere structure of time that consigned the colonized forever to an elsewhere, freedom, democracy, citizenship, leaving an insurmountable distance in its wake that should be possibly overcome through development or mimesis. And the word overcome is something I'll return to in just a moment. Dipesh Chakravarti, in his classic text, Provincializing Europe, called this the waiting room of history. To quote, he wrote, "The modern European idea of history, one might say, came to non-European peoples in the 19th century as somebody's way of saying not yet to somebody else." Consider the classic liberal essays by John Stuart Mill on liberty and on representative government, both of which proclaimed self-rule as the highest form of government and yet argued against giving Indians or Africans self-rule on grounds that were indeed historicist. According to Mill, Indians or Africans were not yet civilized enough to rule themselves. Some historical time of development and civilization, colonial rule and education, to be precise, had to elapse before they could be considered prepared for such a task. Mill's historicist argument thus consigned Indians, Africans, and other rude nations to an imaginary waiting room of history. In doing so, it converted history itself into a version of this waiting room. We were all headed for the same direction, for the same destination, Mill averred, but some people were to arrive earlier than others. That was what historicist consciousness was, a recommendation to the colonized to wait. Acquiring a historical consciousness, acquiring the public spirit that Mill thought absolutely necessary for the art of government, was thus also to learn this art of waiting. This waiting was the realization of the not yet of historicism. For Chakravarti, then, it was anti-colonial nationalism that brought in the revolutionary challenge to waiting and overcoming and unlearning of its intransigent developmental moorings. 20th century anti-colonial democratic demands for self-rule, he wrote, harped insistently on a now as a temporal horizon for action. From about the time of the First World War to decolonization movements of the 50s and 60s, anti-colonial nationalisms were predicated on this urgency of the now. And most importantly for Chakravarti, in their search for a mass base, anti-colonial nationalist movements introduced classes and groups into the sphere of the political that by the standards of 19th century European liberalism could only look ever so unprepared to assume political responsibilities of self-government. These were the peasants, the tribals, the semi-unskilled industrial workers in non-Western cities, men and women from subordinate social groups, in short, the subaltern classes of the Third World. This was the achievement of the now of anti-colonial nationalism. And yet, Chakravarti was acutely aware when he wrote this, that although anti-colonial nationalisms had fiercely rejected the art of waiting, the pedagogic function of waiting, in demanding self-determination in the here and the now, in bringing the subaltern classes of the Third World into democratic political participation, historicism, of the stagist and racist civilizational theory of history on which European ideas of political modernity were based, had certainly not disappeared from the world on achieving this horizon. He noted, it continues to produce not only an enduring tension between Europe and the rest, but also within the post-colony, where now nationalist elites continue to rehearse the schema to their own subaltern classes whenever it becomes necessary and expedient to limit political participation. Chakrabarti explained it could always be said with reason that some people were less modern, backward than others, and that the former needed a period of preparation, a period of waiting before they could be recognized as full participants in political modernity. Now, as Chakravarti tried to reconcile the incomplete national horizon of anti-colonial temporality, of the here and the now, on the one hand, and the persistence of waiting, conditions of waiting in the post-colony, occupations, a suspension and abeyance of fundamental conditions of life as well as political rights for so many. David Scott admonished the kind of position that Chakravarti espoused as a kind of romanticism, of romantic historical investment, an untenable historical investment in anti-colonial nationalist utopias, which have, in fact, as he said, withered into post-colonial nightmares. After all, the stages theory of history had already elaborated the destination through a set of universals that it looked like, of what it should look like, this moment of arrival: nation, freedom, democracy, citizenship, civil society, public culture, museums and art. Even revolution and socialism had their blueprints drafted. Anti-colonial nationalist movements were striving towards that horizon, the end of waiting, demanding it in the now. And while there was furious activity on the eve of formal independence, political decolonization, this moment of political decolonization, to write with all its aspirations, national constitutions, national parades, build national museums, give patronage to national art, the moment of arrival in the post-colony, then now this political decolonization did not break the staged imperial hold of time. And if anything, what we have seen in particularly the last decades, an intensification of the militarization of this waiting room of history, increasingly becoming incarceral rather than pedagogic in its logics and applications. So this is where Abdi's work, and let me add Aliyyah Suleiman's Divine Intervention and other works, which have been formative or an important influence in Abdi's work, make us pay attention or return us to this waiting, condition of waiting itself. There's this coercive structure of waiting, the coercive structure of waiting and the subject position of waiting. The coercive structure of waiting from the ordinary architecture of gates and barricades, structures of stoppages and detours, closing of streets, demands for documents, lining up to obtain documents, the ambiguity of documents, that you may have the right one that momentarily privileges you from the other who does not, the striving for the right one. You'll see some of that in the videos that I'll show. That you can never, and finally the most, so the striving for the right one, that you can never have the right one. These conditions of waiting, condition the waiting. And finally the most intimate condition of waiting, the seemingly erratic disappearance of people that may have done something, but you have no idea what they have done, who happen to be at the wrong time, at the wrong place, creating the condition of waiting for the loved one that should return home, the waiting for people who have yet to return home. As blockage, barrier, or disappearance, the waiting produced by them is never about breaking the law, an arrest or death, but rather the certainty of having broken the law, arrest, death, but rather the uncertainty of it all. Waiting as such is never stasis nor passive, even as a man may appear to sit still in his chair for 45 years. The coercive structure of waiting, whether visible or invisible, simply the mere absence, one could argue, is meant to produce some kinds of terror or despair, futility or impatience. Yet in Abdi's work and in Suleiman's, the waiting is turned into something of itself. There is a refusal of this historicism that is committed to development, progress, and transformation, a movement. It is instead of a movement, a refusal to move on the terms on offer to a horizon one rejects. Now, going back to overcome, David Scott argued that this romantic notion associated with anti-colonial nationalism and the here and now of political decolonization, this indeed meant that this understanding of resistance left us with seeking for a new moment of arrival, that instead we needed to rethink our conception of resistance beyond merely waiting for the revolutionary subject to overcome. This notion of overcoming something was that which instead narrowed the scope of what counted as resistance. Instead of what happens in the waiting itself, it becomes an idea of not overcoming is one that I think you begin to see in this paying attention to the waiting itself. The Man Who Waited for 45 Years is part of the series with The Man Who Walked Around for 3 months, or The Man Who Yawned Continuously for 5 weeks, or The Man Who Went into Hiding when they asked him to shave his mustache. The waiting becomes then part of a seemingly set of seemingly absurd and inconsequential feats, one that could enter, as some of Abadi's other work does, attempts to enter the Guinness Book of World Records, or waiting like the walking around in circles, an activity that yields nothing beyond itself. Nothing beyond itself. By becoming an activity in of itself, it is instead the recuperation, one could argue, of this inconsequentiality, of the dreaming mind, or what Salman Rushdie once wrote as the failure of the dreaming mind. This is particularly the case in Aliyyah Suleiman's film Divine Intervention, where waiting at the Israeli checkpost leads to the exercise of the dreaming mind and fantasies. The absurd and the fantastic become really important, shifting our attention from waiting as fear or despair to waiting as routine in its very uncertainty, as one that does not require overcoming, but one that allows for the dreaming or the imagination of that which is yet inconceivable. The not yet of the waiting room then becomes the not yet of what is possible, an incubation of possibilities. However, in thinking with this, the waiting, paying attention to the waiting as incubation of possibilities, the waiting for those who have disappeared, the condition of waiting, is one that I want to show in the last 2 videos that I'm going to show. This is one of Abadi's works based on the arrival of a large number of people from a region in Pakistan, Pak-Afghan border, people from Hazara in Berlin. They were given, they arrived, the young people from this region had arrived in group to Berlin as refugees. This work is one where she returns to the place where they are from, the condition of disappearances that she then makes this film about. Okay, so I'll just play this and then next. This is a film about Mughal Mase in a small, in Kashmir, Srinagar, Kashmir, and a film about her son, Nazir Ahmad Tali, who's picked up by the Indian security forces and is subjected. And you can read that.
And good night, good night, Islam. You could photo back. Now, Albazo. Who was this person? Listen to himself. What you photo to him soon? Do you photo to Oswarme? You investigate. So, do you photo to him?
Mas se está
The very witness.
Baru sudah asal.
Baru tadi
Yes, work up में दोनों को माइंड क्या करो सारी के आनंद में आइटम joy बहुत रिस्क किया माइंड से कर भी आएंगे
ये विशाल का संबंध स्टोर टाइम पास टाइम कहाँ चार रात स्थिर सिर्फ का आज शेख तीस खाना तीस
So in thinking with the waiting in this condition of waiting, the many different kinds of sociality and organization that emerge in this waiting that might make then us think about this refusal to wait in terms that might be different than the historicism of the end of the waiting room in the moment of political decolonization. So I'm just going to leave it at that.